Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, we are now quite a few weeks into the early access for Path of Exile 2, and this whole time I've been playing my Invoker monk and adjusting my build one little bit at a time. Pretty much every time that I've updated you in the past, the damage has gone up and up a notable amount. But today, while mapping and AoE damage has gone up, the main thing that I have to report is that the tankiness and survivability has gone way up. It is so much more comfortable now. We still one-shot most enemies while mapping, and if I had some higher budget equipment on me, I'd be one-shotting literally everything short of bosses, but the actual comfort while mapping has gone up exponentially. The single target burst now requires some swapping around to slot stuff in, but especially while the pause function exists, that's not the end of the world by any means, at least as far as I'm concerned. So today let's talk about this tri-element update to our Invoker build with a hefty focus on stormweaver, applying massive amounts of cold damage from far away, freezing enemies and shattering them to trigger Herald of Ice, which forces chain reactions, exploding any other enemy within range. The less densely packed an area is, the less impressive this can be, but where it really shines is highly dense content. So things like high tier maps work great with this, as does pretty much every proper endgame activity, ritual, breach, delirium, expedition. All of these send a large dense pack of monsters at you frequently, and this turns dense packs into a pile of burning ice shards on the floor. The main thing helping arrange this today is actually a new unique that we're using that we weren't using before. It's not required to make the build work, but it makes it function on a much lower budget than it otherwise would, and this is the Call of the Brotherhood Topaz Ring. This ring turns all lightning damage into cold damage, as well as increasing your freeze buildup in general, and basically we slot this on for mapping and general AoE type content where freezes and Herald of Ice do most of the work, then we take it off for single target so that we can apply shocks and get some bonus mana leech on top of the freezing and burning that we're doing already. We also use Herald of Ash as a skill to help us with clearing. We apply a ton of overkill damage from the Herald of Ice pops, and Herald of Ash translates that into ignites on any enemies that are surviving. Most of this just helps us burst down rares by killing the smaller enemies that spawn beside them as well. All that said, you could accomplish this without the unique ring if you had a better weapon or better rings than I do with better stats, giving you more cold damage across the board. But the ring is only a few exalted orbs to trade for and fills that role quite effectively in the meantime if you're willing to switch it on and off. All that said, let's break down the skill gems, the spirit gems, and the supports that I've got inside of all of this. Then we'll talk about how to actually play the build within the setup. We'll go over how I've spent my ascendancy points, then my proper passive skill tree, and then we'll talk about my gear as well as any improvements I would make to my equipment given the ability to do so. First up then, we have meditate. What this was just a part of the conscious effort to gain tankiness in the build, along with a general shift towards working in a ton of energy shield instead of being more pure evasion as we were before. I'm currently up to over 5600 energy shield. I was closer to 5100 in most of the footage that you'll see here, as that was a last second helmet upgrade I managed to get, but through a combination of Grim Feast as a spirit seal for mapping and AoE, you go up to double your energy shield maximum while killing enemies, but then we have meditate as well to do exactly that manually instead of after things die, both at the start of a map when you first teleport into a zone before you've killed things, or for single target situations where Grim Feast does not work. And one of its greatest uses is things like pinnacle boss content. If you can get away for a moment in the middle of the fight, you can burst generate thousands of energy shield before re-engaging very quickly on a very short cooldown. You can do this an infinite amount of times as long as the cooldown is up, and we have that quite short. Inside of this we've got Arcane Tempo for increased cast speed to make the process itself faster, and then Ingenuity for 30% increased cooldown recovery on the skill itself, so we can use it more often if we need to. After that we have Stormweaver itself, which is the main mapping skill for the build. This fires out a line of electricity in front of you through the ground. Quality applied to the skill adds a ton of width to the line, so it actually helps a ton with the actual size of the attack fired forwards. This is the only skill that I have a full 6 link on so far, and you don't need to get the full link like this to make it work as a build, it just makes it even better. That said, inside of this I've got Heft to increase the maximum physical damage that the skill can do, which specifically works well if you have a mostly physical damage weapon, which is what I recommend using anyways, as it does affect the skill as long as you have a highly physical weapon. We then also use Primal Armament for 25% more weapon element damage. This counts after the skill converts physical into elemental damage, so both Heft and Primal Armament have massive effect on this skill's output. Then we have Long Shot, which makes Stormwave do up to 35% more damage if it hits enemies more than 3.5 meters away from you, maximum effect at 7 meters away. For comfort, you will generally try to keep enemies further away from you anyways, and then we've got Ambush Support Gem to give double crit chance against full life enemies. This helps us get our free freezes on first hit against most enemies, shattering them into Herald of Ice procs very easily. Then for your last slot, there's one of two good options really depending on the rest of your gear, either Inspiration if you need some more mana help as this would reduce the cost of the skill, or Inevitable Critical otherwise, which increases your crit chance every second that you don't crit with this skill. This mostly takes effect when traveling between packs of enemies to help guarantee that initial crit with ambush ambush as well, triggering a bunch of kills and explosions when you first engage an enemy and get your first freeze and shatter, but it still takes effect just in between casts as well, even if every one is a crit, for at least a very slight bonus just consistently. As well, another option for this that I use generally on more open maps or when I'm doing things like Breach, where I want to just kill a large amount of enemies in a large cone instead of just a line, I'll use something like Upheaval, which will give you 3 fissures coming out of this skill. Instead of just the one straight line, it turns it into 3. Each one does less damage, but if you do it sort of point blank into a large group of enemies, they'll explode even faster and easier. Then we have Tempest Flurry, and from this point it's worth mentioning that we do have some swapping around that will happen for a big single target like proper bosses or pinnacle content, so I will start by continuing the mapping setup, and then I'll tell you what I'd swap out for single target encounters afterwards. Tempest Flurry is mostly used for rares or any enemy that doesn't die to Stormwave in a couple of shots, and more than anything it is used to trigger shockwaves out of Tempest Bell and in combination with Charged Staff to make this happen more effectively. Inside of Tempest Flurry itself, I've got Martial Tempo for increased attack speed, Rage for rage buildup on every melee hit, which is quite powerful, though there is a bit of an internal cooldown on this, but this does give you bonus damage per stack, so it's just pure gain. Stormfire makes shocks from this skill not expire on ignited enemies, and Overcharge makes shocks have less duration, but significantly increased magnitude when applied from this skill. This is a combo lets us apply a super strong shock with infinite duration, as long as we can keep ignites running on an enemy too, which we do just by having a reasonable chunk of flat fire damage on some of our equipment. With another support slot, I would stick in Inspiration here instead for the mana cost reduction, as Tempest Flurry can really eat mana if you spam it for longer durations. After that we have Tempest Bell, and this is the majority of your actual damage for single target situations, reverberating damage out every time that this gets hit, applying ailment buildup for any ailment that is applied to the bell, and importantly increasing the damage of the bell multiplicatively for each ailment that is applied to it as well. Inside of here we have Concentrated Effect for less area of effect on the actual pulses, but more damage from them, Close Combat for increased damage within 1 meter, which the bell will always be anyways, especially with Concentrated Effect on it, then Font of Rage, which makes it passively generate rage for us while it is placed nearby us, and then Immolate, which makes it do 30% more damage as a bonus fire damage against ignited enemies. So basically, while we have fire damage and ignites as a concept within this build, we mostly just use them to enable bonus damage on the bell, stronger strokes from Tempest Flurry when we swap to our single target setup for bosses and such, and then just general bonus elemental damage from some passive choices as well. We then have Charged Staff as our next skill, which is a duration buff that you apply in exchange for power charges. Realistically, this doesn't need to be a part of the build. It is probably the thing I'd be most willing to cut if I didn't want to use an unset ring for the bonus skill slot, but the flat damage that it gives you, and it gives you a bunch of bonus flat lightning damage while attacks while active, is quite useful, and it helps boost up your damage, especially if you are running a relatively budget setup with your gear with less flat damage on it than you'd like. Then you can actually make up for this a decent amount just by using this skill. That said, inside of this I've got Ice Bite for bonus cold damage after freezing an enemy with Charged Staff, Cold Exposure for cold resistance reduction on critical hit with cold damage from the skill, mostly just for enemies that would otherwise have 0 cold resistance to send them into negative resistance and make them even weaker to it, but this also helps for any non-critical hits that you have, as our crits ignore resistances. On a similar note, we have Cold Penetration in here to make it penetrate 30% cold resistance for our non-crits in single target situations. Then finally, Persistence for 40% increased skill duration. This increases the duration of the buff that we get per charge consumed, as well as the maximum duration that the buff can reach too. Next up then we reach our spirit skills, and we are now at the stage within the setup of having 6 spirit skills active for my current body armor through the Ascendancy node that gives bonus spirit based on defensive stats. This is definitely more spirit than I need to have to make the build function. You can use it as 220 if you want everything that I have with some less supports. You can even do it at 190 if you wanted to get out one of the spirit skills too. That said, this is just really comfortable as hell if you can get all of this going together. First up then with our defense and utility style spirit skills, we've got Go Stance over here. This gives us 5% of our evasion rating as energy shield recovered each time we are hit if we have a charge. You generate a charge of this every 3 seconds or so, and while we have a very high focus on energy shield this time around, this still gives us a solid 660 or so energy shield every time I get hit with my current stats, because I still have a lot of evasion anyways, just by being what we are. Inside of this, we've got Fast Forward as a support to speed up the actual recovery of energy shield when this procs, as well as Herbalism to increase life flask recovery while active. If you have less spirit than me, this support here is one of the first things you can drop. We barely ever make use of it. We don't really need to recover life because we are very heavily energy shield focused. It's just there because in my gear I have the spare space and spirit to do so. Then we have the Wind Dancer spirit skill. What this does is give you bonus evasion the longer that you go without getting hit in melee range, and when you do, it loses all stacks of the buff but triggers a knockback and some damage on any nearby enemies, letting you back out of what would otherwise be a very bad situation if it goes down. Inside of this, I've got Energy Barrier, which makes energy shield charge start immediately and not be interrupted for 2 seconds if you get stunned while using this. Maim, which applies maim when enemies trigger the knockback pulse, slowing their movement and making it easier to get away. Then Unbreakable, which gives 200% more stun threshold while the skill is activating too. Then after that we have Combat Frenzy as our next spirit skill, and if you choose not to use Charge Staff, which I mentioned earlier, you obviously don't need this either, but this fully exists to generate us charges for Charge Staff. This gives us a Frenzy charge every time that we freeze an enemy, and through our passive tree we change Frenzy charges into power charges so you can spend them on Charge Staff. Inside here we have the Profusion support gem for a chance at 2 charges generated each time instead of 1, as well as Clarity for increased mana regeneration while the skill is active, which is permanently. Always have the Clarity support gem in one of your active spirit skills no matter what kind of switching things around you do, as it makes a really big difference for our mana sustain. After that we have the Grim Feast spirit skill, which is extremely good for tankiness. It makes enemies drop Grim Remnants on death, which gives you energy shield when you walk over them and pick them up. This can overflow normal maximum energy shield up to double your maximum. This gives us a ton of what is essentially natural regen as well, as long as we are killing things and walking over the corpses, and the overflow it gives us makes us super tanky too. Inside of here we have 2 more spirit reserving support gems that you could drop if you have less spirit than I do. These are Precision for bonus accuracy while active, which only really comes into effect against particularly evasive enemies, and then Cannibalism for life recovery on kill while active, but we rarely, if ever, go down to our actual life pool as mentioned earlier, so again, this is just here because we had the spare space for it. Then we have our Herald skills that we'll be using in the build. Herald of Ice explodes around enemies that are shattered while frozen, causing a lot of our dense mob damage output, spreading a lot of damage into enemies surrounding them. Inside of this we have Cold Infusion for 25% more damage as extra cold damage at the cost of fire and lightning damage from the skill, which is fine as we only use it when we also use the unique that turns lightning damage into cold anyways. Then Magnified Effect for larger radius on the explosions themselves, Elemental Focus for 25% more elemental damage but an inability to apply ailments with Herald of Ice, and this is fine. Our ignites and dense mob clearing content are applied through Herald of Ash, not through the fire damage coming from Herald of Ice, so we don't need this to apply ignites for us, and it can't apply chill or freeze anyways due to how the way it works, so this just boosts the damage a notable amount. Then Cold Mastery for 1 bonus level of the skill too. Then in the final slot here we have Herald of Ash. Again, if you have less spirit or aren't using an unset ring, this isn't really a necessity, but it lets you cleave off more health from rare enemies by turning the enemies that are beside them into bombs when you kill them, essentially. You can have this one at an extremely low actual level so that you don't have to worry about the strength requirements, but just having it does the job that it wants to do, basically. That does it for our mapping and AoE setup then, so let's talk about the swaps for single target. First up, we would swap off our unique ring for a regular ring, and ideally one that has mana leech from physical damage on it to help with mana sustain. Then we'll make some swaps within our skills too. We take Close Combat as well as Font of Rage out of Tempest Bell, as we want Tempest Bell to be much stronger for single target as it's our main output, and inside of it we'll be moving Heft, which increases the maximum physical damage that you get from Tempest Bell, as well as Primal Armament, which increases all of the elemental damage it does by 25% each type of element, and it will be doing all 3 because of the way that we have this set up. Generally you will only use Stormwave in single target if you're just desperately out of range and you want to keep up some form of damage, and so we swap these over to make our single target burst much stronger in general. Then past that you also want to change some spirit skills out. In single target content you will not be taking advantage of Grim Feast unless they're spawning ads. If they are, it's still good, but usually they won't, so it doesn't really matter. Instead, this is where we put in Elemental Invocation. This builds up energy as you freeze, shock, or ignite enemies, and then you can press the button to fire off multiple spells that you want to build up by doing so with the energy that you get. Elemental Invocation requires you to actually press the button, so it's not quite as simple as the other meta skills in the way that they work. It's not quite as brainless and automatic, so we will talk about how to use it properly later. However, inside of Elemental Invocation, we put Eye of Winter, which applies crit weakness to enemies to make them more likely to be critically hit, Ball Lightning for a bunch more shocks as well when you trigger this too, which lets us actually activate the invocation itself more often for more Eyes of Winter, interestingly enough, and then Impetus for increased energy generated and energy retention for a chance to refund half of energy cost when used. This is just great for single target as a combo, as it lets us keep up crit weakness as a consistent debuff on enemies, making our crits more plentiful and making our damage go up significantly as a result. That said, one more change that we make for single target, we take out Herald of Ash and put in Herald of Thunder. Neither of these has an effect on the damage by their actual skill use itself within single target, pure single target, but in our passive tree we get 50% increased damage with elements that have their associated Herald skill active. So Herald of Thunder being active gives us a 50% increase to lightning damage just to have on. Like Herald of Ash, if you have less spirit than I do or aren't using an unset ring, you'd be okay with dropping this out of the setup. Then as for how to actually play using this setup, at the start of any content, always use Meditate to hit maximum overflow on your energy shield. If you do this within your hideout, it does not apply when actually going into a map, You have to do it after going through the portal. For mapping and monster dance content, you just need to fire off storm waves at the enemies, ideally at the longest distance you can for full damage. Enemies will pop each other like a line of dominoes as you do so quite cleanly, and if any enemy, usually a rare, survives a couple of blasts, close the gap on them, hit them with Tempest Flurry, throw down a Tempest Bell, and whack it until they explode. Apply Charged Staff as frequently as needed to keep the full stack buff alive, and otherwise that's pretty much it. For single target, stop thinking about Stormwave unless you are literally out of range of anything else. Otherwise, use Tempest Flurry to generate Tempest Bell combo, throw down the bell once the combo is built up, and then fire out Elemental Invocation if you have the energy built up, then just lay Tempest Flurry down into the bell on top of the boss's face. Repeat this loop until the boss dies, always trying to line up your elemental invocation with the start of each bell so you can have full crit weakness applied when the bell hits its higher burst damage moments. This doesn't have the fastest boss damage. We actually lost the burst phase that we had from Unbound Avatar last time we talked about the build, but again what we gain in exchange is significant survivability, as now instead of being able to die to like a single fuck up on tier 1 Zesht, the Breach Pinnacle boss, I can survive being fully frozen and whacked in the face twice by giant hands on tier 4 Zesht. So I consider that a very successful shift of priorities for the meantime, where my goal was to gain a lot of tankiness. Now the next step for future versions of the build is I want to work out even more single target without losing that tankiness, as both the mapping and survivability feel really great right now, and in comparison single target is lagging behind just a little bit. Obviously gear could fix that immensely and immediately, but I'm never happy with just chalking things up to gear. I don't like telling people to just spend a bunch of like divine orbs to fix the problems. There's always more things that can be messed with and adjusted first. Moving up from that, then we have our ascendancy nodes for the build. First two went into Sunder My Enemies. Select critical hits, ignore any positive elemental resistance that enemies have, which can be very, very powerful situationally. Then the next two went into I Am the Blizzard over here, and this gives you bonus damage as cold damage, which is great in itself, as well as chilled ground created when freezing enemies. Our next set of points went into Lead Me Through Grace, which gives you 1 spirit for every 6 energy shield or 15 evasion rating on your body armor. I've currently got a really nice mixed piece in that slot, and to use my exact setup without the extraneous support gems I have in spirit slots, you would need 190 spirit for general mapping, 220 for single target. Body armors that would allow 220 spirit would be along the lines of 900 evasion and 360 energy shield. Obviously it'll take a bit of math to see if you're at that point with gear that you're acquiring, but that's not unreasonable to achieve, and anything past that is just a pure bonus. Then our final ascendancy points went into Meditate itself for all of the extra energy shield management that it can offer us. If you want to drop tankiness for burst damage, you can always swap that out to being Unbound Avatar instead for the same number of points, but personally I find the setup with Meditate much more comfortable, and I view comfort and survival as being very important if you want to properly farm high tier maps and if you want to get to higher levels without getting your XP reset constantly. After that we have our passive skill tree itself, the full thing, and we have quite a few changes from the last time that I've shared this. We will still start by heading up the evasion and energy shield nodes right near the beginning here. We branch off for Essence of the Mountain here for bonus damage as cold damage and bonus freeze buildup as well. Then we wrap around through the bonus evasion and energy shield notable through to some stats as well as bonus attack speed too. We go up through the bonus crit chance and bonus damage after getting a critical hit chance nodes here and through to the attribute track over here, and we go both ways on this. For your attributes, generally speaking, you want a reasonably even split between dexterity and intelligence, probably leaning a bit more towards dexterity early and a bit more towards intelligence later on once we get a unique we'll talk about later. But for now, basically follow the actual requirements of your gear and your skills. Put in the amount of intelligence that you need to use all of your equipment and your skills as a reasonable level, and then funnel everything else into dexterity, at least for the meantime, unless you have something I'll talk about later. That said, we go up and around here into the tri-element increasing nodes, and this is a tri-elemental build, so this actually does us quite a lot of good. In here we get general elemental damage increase. We also get Echoing Frost, which gives you increased elemental damage if you chilled an enemy recently, which we always will be. You get Echoing Flames, which is basically the same thing but for igniting an enemy, which we again always will be, and then Echoing Thunder is the same thing for shocking enemies, which we will only really be doing when we swap off the ring, but when we do, this is a nice chunk of bonus damage. As well, we go through here to get a bunch of increases to our maximum energy shield at the cost of some maximum mana, but also we get some mana regeneration rate in exchange, so this just ends up being a ton of bonus energy shield as a result. We go down towards the actual starting nodes for the int based classes, the full int classes, which also give us another 30% energy shield and maximum maximum energy shield as additional stun threshold too, which is quite nice, and then even more maximum energy shield and a little bit of bonus intelligence too. Then we go off the other track here, and before we even go anywhere, we'll be getting all of these evasion and energy shield increasing nodes, including the notable Immaterial. This gives you increased evasion rating if energy shield recharge has started in the past couple of seconds, as well as just increased evasion rating while you have energy shield in general. Based on the way that we are building now, this seems like a natural way to add a sort of extra layer of defense under everything else. Then we move over here to some sort of in the meantime nodes is what I'm going to call these. They only exist here for now. They will be replaced when I have more skill points and can access further nodes. But for now, we have these three, which are just increased attack damage, and increased attack damage while on full life, which we will pretty much always be due to the massive stacking of energy shield we are now doing. Then we branch off up here a little bit to get to the resonant keystone. This is what turns the frenzy charges that we generate from combat frenzy into power charges so that we can use them on charged staff. After this, we go up to our first jewel slot for the build. In these, generally for damage increases, you want things like increased attack speed or damage with quarterstaves. Increased herald damage is great for mapping specifically. Increased mana leech or general increased elemental damage. For more defensive jewels though, instead you would want sapphires, and ideally ones with increased maximum energy shield. Percentage of maximum energy shield as stun threshold is actually awesome in our current high energy shield threshold too, as it can help you from getting stunned in various situations. Then ideally you'd want things as well on this like extra cold damage or freeze buildup, as that would be lovely too. We then pick up a bunch of critical hit nodes for crit chance over here, as well as critical damage bonus, and this also gives us increased damage if we've done a critical hit recently, which we pretty much always will with the way that we are set up. After this, we finish off this sort of branch by getting a bunch of extra attack speed, as well as a cost reduction for our skills, and some extra evasion and energy shield, both of which being stacked up a decent amount from those. Then we move over here and we grab one last notable before going out to the outer track, grabbing some evasion and energy shield on the way through as well, which is nice, into Spectral Ward. This gives you +1 maximum energy shield for every 12 evasion rating on your equipped body armor. With my current body armor, the way that mine is, this actually gives me just around 90 energy shield underneath all the other energy shield increased nodes, which will scale off of that bonus too. We then head out through another jewel socket out here, down to the quarterstaff cluster on the side, inside of which we grab most of the left side for bonus crit chance, bonus crit damage with quarterstaffs, bonus attack speed with quarterstaffs, freeze buildup, attack speed, and then even stun buildup with quarterstaffs too, which is very lovely. The only main change from this sort of cluster here from the last time that we talked about it is I've taken out the one with the storm notable, as the only thing that we use power charges on right now is charged staff with no extra charges, and with that it just doesn't feel necessary to have this node, and it saves us a point to spend elsewhere instead. Then we move down to the actual herald cluster here. This gives you generally increased damage while you have any herald skills active, but then importantly, coming calamity gives you increased elemental damage matching the types of the heralds that you have active. So Herald of Ice gives you extra cold damage, Herald of Thunder gives you extra lightning damage, Herald of Ash gives you extra fire damage, and we line that up quite well with the way that we use them. Then we have this just massively useful crit cluster here, a bunch of crit damage bonus on the bottom side here, into Struck Through. This is bonus base crit chance. This means that this extra crit chance applies under every single bit of increased crit chance that we have under everything, which means that it actually has a massive effect, and even though it says +1%, that 1% will give you a lot more in the long run with all the other layers on top of it. We also grab Heart Stopping here on the way back, just because this is a very, very powerful use of a singular point, and then we go up through over to our evasion and dexterity focus nodes here. We grab Enhanced Reflexes, which gives you 30% increased evasion rating, but more importantly than that, 8% increased dexterity. A percent increase in dexterity is very useful for what we're about to be grabbing. We then grab a bunch more evasion rating and dexterity all the way through here, over on our way to get through to Falcon Technique. This gives you increased attack speed for every 15 dexterity that you have. Currently I'm getting around 15% attack speed from this with my current stats. You can get a lot more with better gear, with more attributes, so this is a very valuable, notable passive right here. At this point, that's the end of what I've spent right now. I am level 91, so I have 9 points left to spend. I mentioned earlier that I will be taking out these 3, which makes us have 12 points left to spend instead, and these are very well planned for the moment. 1, 2, 3, 4, over to the outside of Chaos Inoculation, which is 5, that's 5 points spent, and Chaos Inoculation I want to grab when I've got somewhere around 6,500 energy shield. That would put me to around 13,000 energy shield with all of Overflow active, which is enough energy shield that I don't feel like I will ever go down to my life pool, and so if your maximum life is 1, it's not a problem, and being immune to chaos damage is extremely good, especially when you're focusing on energy shield. So that's 5 points out of 12, 6 into this jewel slocket, 7, 8, 9, 10 for more energy shield, 11 for a massive chunk of bonus energy shield at the cost of slower energy shield recharge. However, we usually recharge our energy shield by picking up the Grim Remnants for Grim Feast or by using Meditate, so this isn't that big of a deal of a negative for us. We only get the massive positive of a big chunk of bonus energy shield. And then the final point into Ingenuity for 25 bonus intelligence. Mostly this just lets us change some of our intelligence attribute nodes over to dexterity in our setup so that we can get more attack speed from Falcon Technique. As well, super long-term plans for this setup involve the Hand of Wisdom and Action unique gloves, which I can't currently afford to trade for and haven't been lucky enough to have drop myself yet, but these also give bonus attack speed per dexterity, but importantly, bonus flat lightning damage to attacks depending on your intelligence, which has a lot of long-term sort of scaling potential for us later on. Speaking of which, let's talk about our equipment in general. Starting with the weapon itself, mine is solid for the budget that I have, but it could be much better. An ideal quarterstaff for the setup is a highly physical base, ideally slicing or barrier quarterstaff, so you either get a slight damage bonus or some block chance depending on which one you go for, then with a reasonably well-rolled flat physical damage increase and percent increase to physical damage as well. If you can, bonus to elemental damage with weapons or any of the 3 flat elemental damage additions that you can get as a modifier are other solid prefixes. Aside from that, critical damage bonus is a super effective suffix right now, seemingly being treated as a multiplier on weapons instead of an added bonus, which is very, very strong as a result. Attack speed is also really, really good. Crit chance on weapon adds to base crit chance underneath your other bonuses, like that one passive we talked about earlier, so it can give you a lot of bonus power. And as I usually say, bonus levels to melee skills is a really, really strong modifier you can get on multiple pieces of gear, but it requires your gear to be much better than mine to take proper advantage of it, because it increases the mana costs of your skills dramatically. So only aim for bonus melee skill levels if you know that you have above average mana regen or sustain to make it function. Then for your body armor, we've got to focus on energy shield and evasion rating above all else, sort of stack these split defenses and also stack spirit you get from this piece with your ascendancy nodes. But then you also want any resistances you can or other bonuses that you can get on top of that, which would be absolutely ideal to fit on this piece, and pure bonuses. For your rings, for mapping, ideally the Call of the Brotherhood ring is just absolutely fantastic for just a few exalted orbs of trading, but it's unnecessary if you have enough cold damage increases and flat cold damage between your rings, your gloves, or your weapon in general. The main point of this is just to make it more consistent to quickly freeze enemies and proc Herald of Ice on a lower budget. My setup uses one unset ring as well for the bonus skill slot that gives, and I talked about how to adjust it earlier if you don't want to use an unset ring item base, but generally your goals for rings are flat elemental damage. Specifically, you absolutely want flat cold and flat fire modifiers at least one place across all of your gear, but multiple makes it a bit more consistent. You also want percent increases to cold or lightning damage, attributes, resistances, and ideally on the ring that you would stick on for single target instead of your unique, you would have a bit more of the same stuff, but also a bit of physical damage leached as mana too. And mana regeneration would be lovely on either ring as well. On your amulet, you want bonuses for energy shield and resistances. Bonus crit chance would be great if you got it here. Bonus mana regen is lovely, and for instilling delirium into it, I recommend Storm Charge from the way over in the top left section of the skill tree that we had never actually reached. This gives you a ton of general elemental damage increase if you've dealt a critical hit recently, which we will do, as well as a chunk of increased crit chance to make that even easier to do. This takes 2 fears and an envy to actually instill as far as the emotions required. Otherwise, on a bit more of a budget, you could do Tainted Strike for a 25% increase to crit chance and 30% increased magnitude of non-damaging ailments. This one is Ire, 1 Despair, and 1 Greed. I mentioned it earlier, but if you had them and the attributes to actually support them and make them worth it, the Hand of Wisdom and Action unique gloves as well would be awesome to add into this setup. And then for your helmet, we've got a heavy focus on energy shield, and ideally this could also have bonus crit chance and solve resistances as well. Then for your boots, you want movement speed above everything else. Then energy shield and resistances are great in this slot, and then for belt, long term we'd be using the Ingenuity unique for this slot like pretty much everyone else's. A cheaper alternative but still expensive is Headhunter for specifically mapping to give you modifiers from the rares that you kill, and until you can afford either one of those, you basically just want to use your belt for resistances, some mana help if you can, and some extra stun threshold too could help boost that just a touch. All that covered, the obvious elephant in the room that's remaining is you do also ideally want increased rarity of items found on every applicable slot that you can have it to, which is why I have as much of that as I can because it's very valuable long term, but this will significantly increase the price to trade for any one of these items compared to getting the exact same items without that rarity modifier. So you have to sort of balance that and decide how much extra currency you're willing to shell out when upgrading your pieces to get yourself higher rates of currency dropping as a result, so keep that in mind too. that just about does it for today, everyone. A full breakdown of what my Invoker build is currently looking like after a number of changes over the holidays. Generally, more consistent mapping, far better survivability and comfort as a result, and while the single target damage is a bit less bursty, the survivability that we've gained in exchange for that feels just like a ridiculous level of extra comfort added to playing this setup and farming with it on higher tier maps and endgame activities as well. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.